The Mafia boss was supposed to die at Lot 17, an $8 million forged sculpture, 3 ex-military snipers, and a billionaire's desperation to bury the journalist he'd already murdered. Instead, Caleb Maddox stood in front of 400 recording phones and bid $16 million on his own assassination, forcing Preston Hale to choose between exposure and elimination, while the woman who'd warned him held evidence that would destroy everything. But that moment was still 7 minutes away. Right now, the red dot had just appeared on his chest exactly when the auctioneer raised the first gavel. A perfect coincidence that would have been elegant if it weren't meant to end his life. "Smile like it's a joke," she murmured against his ear, her breath warm against the ink crawling up his neck. "Red dot on your head." The Mafia boss actually smiled, and in that instant the entire ballroom shifted. He stood near the eastern colonnade of the Wilmington Regent Ballroom, surveying 400 guests who believed themselves safe in their evening gowns and borrowed confidence. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across polished floors below, where champagne flutes caught reflections like tiny surveillance cameras, revealing secrets their holders preferred to keep buried. The annual charity art auction had transformed the historic ballroom into a gallery of human ambition. Each attendee a carefully curated facade. Caleb's hand remained steady on a champagne flute he had no intention of drinking, his tailored charcoal suit doing little to hide the ink that crawled from his wrists to his collar. Serpents and compass roses and Latin phrases that told the story of a man who'd built an empire from blood and calculation. He'd attended events like this for 5 years, each time watching fortunes change hands over art that most buyers couldn't properly appreciate and deals that most citizens would never comprehend. Tonight felt different in ways his instincts couldn't articulate. A tension beneath the practiced elegance that made the tattoos on his knuckles itch like they always did before violence found him. The orchestra played Chopin, while servers circulated with precision that would shame military operations. Their trays balanced with the expertise of people who understood invisible hierarchies and unspoken threats. The air smelled of imported roses and old money and something else. Gunpowder residue, maybe, or just the metallic tang of danger that Caleb had learned to taste before it arrived. Below, a woman moved through the crowd with purpose that contradicted the casual grace of her movements. Her champagne gold dress caught light in ways that seemed almost calculated, the fabric clinging to curves that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. She stopped at each display podium, adjusting the positioning of information cards with fingers that suggested intimate knowledge of every piece. Renaissance bronzes, pre-Columbian jade, oil paintings whose provenance she probably knew better than their own creators. Her dark hair was swept into an updo that belonged in art history textbooks. Classic without competing with the younger socialites who surrounded her like decorative noise. She consulted a leather portfolio, making notes with movements so economical they bordered on military, checking sightlines, cataloging faces, mapping exit routes disguised as aesthetic appreciation. Caleb recognized a fellow predator when he saw one. The economy of movement that separated professionals from pretenders in every dangerous field he'd ever mastered. This woman wasn't performing for the crowd. She was conducting an operation with variables only she could see, and outcomes she'd already calculated 3 moves ahead. She glanced up suddenly, her eyes scanning the colonnade with the swift assessment of someone who understood that danger always occupied the high ground. Their gazes met for precisely 3 seconds before she returned her attention to a forged Bernini sculpture that dominated the room's northern corner. A piece Caleb knew was worth less than the pedestal it rested on, but that Preston Hale was laundering $8 million through tonight. The moment passed without acknowledgement. Yet something in that brief connection told Caleb she'd cataloged every detail about him. The ink, the scar through his left eyebrow, the way he stood with his weight on his back foot like someone always ready to move, just as he'd begun cataloging her. He descended the marble stairs with measured steps, nodding to acquaintances whose names he remembered, but whose significance had long since faded into background static. A city councilman grabbed his shoulder with the familiarity of someone who believed shared corruption constituted real friendship, launching into complaints about zoning regulations that Caleb deflected with practiced phrases that meant nothing and promised less. He extracted himself near a display of stolen manuscripts, their illuminated edges contrasting sharply with the hard angles of the evening's unspoken violence. The woman in champagne gold now stood beside a collection of Renaissance bronzes, her posture suggesting she was simultaneously present and removed from her surroundings, a ghost haunting her own operation. She spoke quietly with an elderly collector whose hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward a marble bust, his enthusiasm genuine in a room full of calculated interest. Caleb moved closer, pretending to examine a painting that depicted the Delaware River at dusk, all muted colors and implied melancholy. From this angle, he could hear fragments of the woman's voice, cultured and controlled, with an accent that suggested expensive education rather than geographical origin, and grief that ran deeper than any curriculum could teach. "The provenance is impeccable," she was saying, her tone carrying the kind of certainty that ended arguments before they could begin. "I've verified each piece personally through 3 independent sources, including the original acquisition documents from the Castellano estate sale." Liar, Caleb thought, but an interesting one. The Castellano pieces had been lost to fire in 1987. Whatever she was verifying, it wasn't authenticity. The collector nodded, reassured by her expertise, while Caleb noted the subtle way she'd positioned herself to observe both the main entrance and the service corridors that led to the kitchen. Most people didn't think about exit strategies at charity galas. Most people didn't need to. A server approached with champagne, the bubbles rising in perfect columns that spoke to quality most guests would never consciously notice. Caleb accepted a glass he wouldn't touch, using it as a prop for the role he played in rooms like this. Civilized, legitimate, safe. The woman concluded her conversation and turned, nearly colliding with him in a moment that might have been accidental if her eyes hadn't already known exactly where he stood. She stepped back with a murmured apology that carried no real contrition, only the social lubrication necessary for smooth interactions between strangers who were anything but. "The Caravaggio is a forgery," she said quietly, nodding toward the painting he'd been pretending to study, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "Excellent work, but the chiaroscuro in the lower right quadrant betrays a modern hand attempting to channel a master's darkness." Caleb shifted his weight imperceptibly, a movement most wouldn't notice but that changed his angle to the room by crucial degrees. Opening sight lines and tactical options, closing vulnerabilities and blind spots. The tattoos on his neck caught the chandelier light as he turned slightly, and he saw her gaze flicker to them for a fraction of a second before returning to his face. "You have a good eye," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gravel that came from giving orders in rooms where disobedience meant death. "Professional hazard." She extended her hand with the formality of someone conducting business, not making friends. "Ava Rourke. I curated this collection." Her grip was firm, her palms slightly calloused in a way that suggested she did more than arrange pedestals and write catalog descriptions. Up close, he could see the tension in her jaw, the careful control in her breathing, the way her eyes tracked movement in his peripheral vision with the vigilance of someone who'd learned that survival required constant awareness. "Caleb Maddox." Recognition flickered across her face. Brief, controlled, but unmistakable. She knew exactly who he was, which meant she knew what he was, and she'd approached him anyway. "I know," she said simply. The orchestra transitioned to something darker, more ominous. Shostakovich, maybe, or one of those Russian composers who understood that beauty and violence weren't opposites but lovers. The crowd moved around them like water around stones, oblivious to the current of danger that had just connected two people who shouldn't be standing this close. Ava's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. Something that tasted like gasoline waiting for a match. She leaned in, her lips near his ear in a gesture that to anyone watching would look like flirtation. A beautiful woman whispering something intimate to a dangerous man at a glittering event where secrets were currency and appearances were everything. Her breath was steady. Her voice was not. "Smile like it's a joke," she murmured, each word precise and weighted. "Red dot on your head." Caleb's instincts flared like a knife finding flesh. He smiled, slow, dangerous, the kind of expression that had preceded violence in 100 rooms darker than this one. To anyone watching, it looked like charm, like a man enjoying a beautiful woman's attention, but his eyes had already found them. 3 positions, 3 angles, 3 lines of fire converging on the exact spot where he stood. The balcony overlooking the western entrance, the service corridor near the kitchen, the second-floor gallery that framed the ballroom like a theater of death. Professional placement, military precision, the kind of kill operation that cost 6 figures and left no witnesses. "How many?" he asked quietly, his smile never wavering, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the gun hidden beneath his jacket. "3 shooters," Ava said, her own expression shifting into something that might have been a smile if it reached her eyes. "Ray Porter on the balcony, Joel Barrett in the corridor, Liam Cross in the gallery, all ex-military, all very expensive, all aimed at you." She pulled back slightly, her hand still resting on his arm in a touch that looked casual, but felt like an anchor keeping him from moving into the bullet that was already waiting for him. "Preston Hale," she added, her voice dropping even lower. "He's laundering $8 million through tonight's auction. Forged Bernini, stolen manuscripts, fake Caravaggio. Your presence complicates his operation. So he's removing you." Caleb's smile widened, became something almost genuine, almost amused. "And you're telling me this because?" For the first time, that's all, something raw flickered across Ava's carefully controlled face. Pain. Rage. Grief so deep it had hollowed her out and rebuilt her into something harder. "Because Preston Hale killed my brother," she said simply. "And I need you alive to help me destroy him." The orchestra played on. The crowd laughed and drank and admired art they couldn't authenticate and didn't care to question. Champagne bubbles rose like tiny prayers that would never be answered. And in the center of it all, a mafia boss and a curator stood close enough to look like lovers, while 3 red dots waited patiently for the perfect moment to end everything. Caleb's hand remained steady on his champagne flute. His smile remained fixed. His eyes remained sharp. But everything had just changed. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that had built empires and buried enemies, "we should give them a show worth remembering." Ava's smile finally reached her eyes. It was beautiful and terrible, and promised violence. "I thought you'd never ask." The trick to surviving an assassination attempt at a charity gala, Caleb had learned over 15 years of living dangerously, was to treat it like choreography. Every movement deliberate, every expression calculated, every breath a performance for an audience that included both the wealthy oblivious and the deadly attentive. "We need to move," he murmured, his lips barely shifting from the smile that had become a mask. "Slowly, like we're enjoying each other's company." Ava's hand slid from his arm to his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that would read as romantic intimacy to anyone watching. Her palm was warmer than he expected, steadier than it should have been for someone who'd just warned a mafia boss about 3 trained killers waiting to end him. The Bernini sculpture, she said quietly, her eyes tracking the room with the precision of someone who'd mapped every inch of it weeks ago. Northwest corner. It's on a rotating pedestal. If we position ourselves behind it, the sightlines break. Ray Porter loses his angle from the balcony. Caleb's respect for her ticked up another notch. Most people froze when Death entered the room. She was already 3 moves ahead. And the other 2? Joel Barrett in the service corridor can't fire without hitting civilians. He's ex-Marine. Rules of engagement are hardwired, even for hired killers. Liam Cross in the gallery. She paused, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He doesn't have rules. We need to account for him differently. They began moving, not toward the sculpture directly, but in a meandering path that suggested casual interest in the art rather than tactical repositioning. Caleb guided her with subtle pressure on her lower back, his body angled to shield her from the balcony as they walked. Old habits, protective instincts that he rarely allowed himself to indulge. The ballroom had been designed in the Gilded Age, when Wilmington's industrial wealth demanded spaces that could showcase both art and power. Mirrored panels lined the walls between marble columns, creating infinite reflections that multiplied the crowd into an army of ghosts. The effect was meant to be beautiful. Tonight it felt strategic, every mirror a potential vantage point, every reflection a possible threat. "Tell me about your brother," Caleb said, keeping his voice conversational as they paused before a Renaissance bronze of Mercury in flight. To anyone watching, they were 2 people discussing art. In reality, he was using the bronze's polished surface to track the balcony behind them. Ava's fingers tightened slightly on his. "Jonah," she said, her voice carrying a carefully controlled grief that told him she'd practiced saying his name without breaking. He was an investigative journalist, the kind who believed truth mattered more than safety. He was working on a story about real estate fraud, luxury developments built on forged property titles, money laundered through art acquisitions, political bribes disguised as charitable donations. Preston Hale, she confirmed. Jonah got too close. Found original documents proving Hale had been forging provenance files for stolen artwork, then donating the pieces to museums for tax write-offs while keeping the originals in private collections. 8 months ago, Jonah was found in his apartment. Official cause of death? Accidental overdose. Fentanyl. Caleb heard what she wasn't saying. Your brother didn't use drugs. Jonah was training for a marathon. He didn't even drink coffee. Her voice stayed level, but something raw flickered in her eyes when she glanced at him. The police closed the case in 48 hours. No investigation, no questions, just another young journalist who couldn't handle the pressure. They moved again, angling toward the Bernini sculpture, a marble representation of Apollo and Daphne that dominated the northwest corner like a frozen scream. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, which made the forgery even more insulting. Caleb could see the tells now that he knew what to look for. The too perfect symmetry, the slightly wrong patina, the chisel marks that followed modern patterns rather than Baroque intuition. So you became a curator, Caleb said. I became a weapon, Ava corrected quietly. I'd been working in art authentication for 3 years before Jonah died. After, I leveraged every contact I had to get close to Hale's operation. Spent 18 months building credibility, establishing myself as an expert who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. 6 months ago, Hale hired me to curate his private collection and manage his public acquisitions. You've been gathering evidence. Photographs of every piece, provenance files showing the forgeries, financial records linking the art sales to offshore accounts, communications between Hale and Senator Douglas Reed about kickbacks and political protection. She smiled, and it was the saddest thing Caleb had seen in years. I have everything I need to destroy him. I just needed to survive long enough to deliver it. They reached the sculpture, positioning themselves so the marble partially blocked the balcony sightline. Caleb used the moment to scan the room more thoroughly, his tactical awareness cataloging threats with the efficiency of years spent surviving in rooms full of enemies. The crowd had grown denser as the auction's start time approached. Approximately 400 people now, most clustered near the main display area where the auctioneer was setting up his podium. Servers circulated with fresh champagne. A string quartet had replaced the orchestra, their music lighter, more suitable for conversation. And everywhere, people wore mirrors. The women's jewelry caught light and threw it back in fractured patterns. Crystal-beaded gowns became moving surfaces of reflection. Even the men's watches and cufflinks turned into tiny surveillance cameras, capturing angles and images without their owner's awareness. Caleb caught movement in one of those reflections, a man in a server's uniform moving through the crowd with purpose that didn't match his tray's casual offerings. He was heading toward the service corridor, positioning for the kill. "Joel Barrett is moving," Caleb said quietly. Ava didn't look. Didn't need to. "The auction starts in 7 minutes. Hale will want you dead before the bidding begins. Less chaos. Easier to control the narrative." "Where's Hale now?" "VIP lounge. 2nd floor. Eastern wing. He watches his auctions from there. Private viewing, separate entrance, armed security that's actually his personal kill team pretending to be event staff." Her voice carried bitter familiarity. "He likes to see everything but never be seen. Control without presence." Caleb processed that, his mind already working through scenarios and countermeasures. Preston Hale had built an empire on staying invisible, forging art, laundering money, ordering murders, all while maintaining the respectable facade of a billionaire philanthropist. The kind of criminal who understood that true power meant never having to get blood on your own hands. But even invisible men cast shadows. And Caleb had built his reputation on finding people who didn't want to be found. "I need to make a call," he said, pulling out his phone with his free hand, the other still holding Ava's, maintaining the illusion of romantic interest for any watchers. "My head of security, Mudrick Cole. He's already positioned outside with my detail, but he needs to know the threat level just escalated. They'll be monitoring communications," Ava warned. "Hale's people have signal jammers throughout the building. You won't get a clean connection." Caleb smiled, and this time it carried genuine amusement. "Modric doesn't need phones. We worked out hand signals years ago for situations exactly like this." He shifted his position slightly, adjusting his stance so he faced the ballroom's main entrance where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the street. 3 stories down, barely visible through the decorative ironwork and evening shadows, a black SUV sat at the curb. As Caleb watched, the vehicle's headlights flashed once, then twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. Message received. Threat acknowledged. Ready to extract. Caleb returned the signal by adjusting his jacket, a gesture that would look like casual grooming to anyone watching, but that Mudrick would read as confirmation. The headlights flashed once more. Standing by. "Your security seems efficient," Ava observed, having caught the exchange with the sharp awareness of someone who missed nothing. "Mudrick saved my life in Kandahar," Caleb said. "That was 12 years ago. I returned the favor in Prague. That was 8 years ago. We've been saving each other ever since. When you trust someone with your life enough times, communication becomes instinct." Something softened in Ava's expression. Not much, but enough that Caleb noticed. "Jonah and I were like that," she said quietly. "We had our own language, our own codes. After our parents died, it was just us against the world. We didn't need words to understand each other." The past tense hung between them like smoke. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, and meant it. He'd lost people. Knew the specific weight of grief that came from losing the ones who knew you before you became who you had to be to survive. Ava nodded, accepting the condolence without commentary. Then her expression sharpened, her attention snapping back to tactical awareness. The auctioneer is starting preliminary announcements. 5 minutes until bidding begins. Hale will want you eliminated before the Bernini piece comes up. It's lot 17, approximately 20 minutes into the auction. So we have 20 minutes to stay alive and ruin his entire operation. Essentially, yes. Caleb felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not quite excitement, not quite anticipation, but something close to both. He'd spent 15 years building an empire through calculated violence and careful strategy. He'd eliminated rivals, absorbed territories, established dominance through methods that kept him awake at night when his conscience bothered to make an appearance. But he'd never fought alongside someone like Ava Rourke. Someone who understood that survival required both elegance and ruthlessness. Someone who'd turned grief into precision and rage into purpose. "Tell me something," he said, his voice dropping even lower as the crowd's attention shifted toward the auctioneer's podium. "If you could destroy Hale right now, completely, permanently in front of everyone, would you do it? Even if it meant burning your own credibility? Even if it meant you could never work in this field again?" Ava met his eyes, and in her gaze, Caleb saw the answer before she spoke it. "Jonah believed truth was worth dying for," she said. "I believe truth is worth killing for. So yes, without hesitation, without regret, I would burn everything, my career, my reputation, my future, if it meant exposing what Hale really is." "Good," Caleb said. "Because that's exactly what we're about to do." The auctioneer's voice rose above the crowd's murmur, amplified by speakers that carried his practiced enthusiasm through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wilmington Regent's annual art charity auction. Tonight, we have the privilege of presenting some of the most extraordinary pieces in private collection." Ava's hand tightened on Caleb's. "It's starting." "Then let's give them a show," Caleb said. And somewhere in the shadows, 3 men with rifles adjusted their positions and waited for the perfect moment to kill. The auctioneer's voice carried across the ballroom like a benediction, smooth and practiced, wrapping mundane greed in the language of cultural preservation. Caleb watched the crowd's attention shift toward the podium, felt the room's energy consolidate into something focused and hungry. This was the moment, when everyone looked in the same direction, when guards relaxed fractionally, when killers adjusted their positions for clearer shots. Ava leaned closer, her champagne gold dress brushing against his jacket, her perfume cutting through the ballroom's expensive air with notes of jasmine and something darker, more complex. To the elderly couple examining a nearby sculpture, they looked like lovers sharing secrets. To the 3 men positioned throughout the ballroom with rifles, they looked like a problem becoming increasingly complicated. Ray Porter served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Ava murmured, her lips barely moving, her eyes tracking the balcony's reflection in a nearby mirror. Sniper. 87 confirmed kills. Dishonorably discharged for executing a civilian contractor who witnessed something he shouldn't have. The military buried it. Preston Hale recruited him 6 months later. She paused, her hand tightening imperceptibly on Caleb's arm. "He doesn't miss, ever. The only reason you're still breathing is because I'm standing between you and his sightline." Caleb felt his instincts flare, that electric awareness that had kept him alive through 15 years of living in rooms full of people who wanted him dead. He shifted his weight, angling his body to keep Ava shielded while opening his own line of sight to the balcony. The movement looked casual, like a man adjusting his stance to better appreciate the woman beside him. In reality, it was pure tactical calculation. "Joel Barrett in the service corridor," Ava continued, her voice barely audible beneath the auctioneer's enthusiastic description of lot number 3, a Renaissance bronze that Caleb could tell from across the room was worth maybe 1/10 of its listed value. Marine Force Recon, specialized in close quarters elimination. He left the service after Fallujah with a medical discharge that was actually a cover for PTSD, so severe they couldn't risk him in active duty. Hale pays him twice what the military did and doesn't ask questions about collateral damage. The string quartet transitioned to something lighter, more baroque, all mathematical precision and controlled emotion. Waiters continued their circulation, offering champagne and canapés to people who'd already consumed more than they needed but couldn't resist consuming more. Somewhere in that choreographed service, Joel Barrett moved with purpose that contradicted his uniform's implied subservience. "And Liam Cross," Caleb said quietly, having already identified the third shooter from posture alone, the way he stood in the gallery overlooking the ballroom's southern exposure, the careful angle of his body that suggested weapon discipline and patience. "Let me guess. Special operations. Disavowed. Operates without official existence." "British SAS originally," Ava confirmed, her professional knowledge of Hale's kill team both impressive and deeply troubling. "Burned after an operation in Syria went sideways. Officially died in a training accident 5 years ago. Unofficially works for whoever pays him enough to justify the risk. Preston Hale keeps him on permanent retainer for problems that require absolute discretion and 0 witnesses." Caleb processed that, his mind cataloging the threat level with the clinical efficiency of years spent surviving impossible situations. 3 professional killers. 3 perfect angles. 3 men who'd been paid enough to ensure they wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't question, wouldn't leave anything to chance. Most people would panic. Most people would run. Most people would be dead before they reached the exits. But Caleb Maddox hadn't built an empire by being most people. "You've done your research," he said, genuine respect coloring his tone despite the circumstances. "Most civilians wouldn't know to catalog their enemies with this level of detail." "I'm not most civilians," Ava said, and something in her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "When Preston Hale killed my brother, I became someone different. Someone who understands that knowledge is the only weapon that matters when you're outgunned, outmanned, and fighting alone against an enemy who owns the police, the politicians, and the press." The auctioneer struck his gavel, declaring Lot 3 sold for $60,000 to a woman in the front row whose diamonds probably cost more than the bronze she'd just purchased. Applause rippled through the crowd, polite and perfunctory, the sound of wealth congratulating itself on its own good taste. Caleb used the noise as cover, pulling his phone from his jacket with the casual gesture of a man checking messages rather than coordinating a counter-operation. He typed quickly, muscle memory allowing him to compose without looking at the screen. 3 shooters. Professional. Coordinate exterior intercept. Prepare extraction route alpha. The message went to Mudrick Cole, encrypted through channels that Preston Hale's signal jammers couldn't touch because Caleb had paid someone significantly smarter than Hale's technical team to build them. Within seconds, his phone vibrated once. Acknowledgement received. Orders being executed. "Your security is moving," Ava observed, having tracked the SUV's subtle shift in position through the ballroom's windows. "Does he know what he's walking into?" "Mudrick knows exactly what he's walking into," Caleb said. "And he's prepared for it. We've survived worse odds in worse places with worse backup. This is just another Thursday." Ava's expression flickered, something between admiration and disbelief, and the kind of exhausted recognition that came from realizing you weren't as alone as you'd believed yourself to be. "You're either the most confident man I've ever met, or the most suicidal." "I've been called both," Caleb admitted. "Usually by the same people. Sometimes in the same conversation." The auctioneer moved to Lot 4, a collection of pre-Columbian jade figurines that Ava had authenticated personally, and that Caleb suspected were the only genuinely valuable pieces in tonight's entire auction. The crowd's interest sharpened, bids climbing with the competitive enthusiasm of people who measured worth by what others coveted rather than what actually mattered. Ava watched the bidding with the focused attention of someone whose expertise was being displayed and evaluated simultaneously. When the lot sold for twice its estimated value, she didn't smile, didn't show satisfaction, just made a small notation in the leather portfolio she'd been carrying all evening, like a shield between herself and the world she'd infiltrated. Lot 17 is the Bernini, she said quietly, referencing the forged sculpture that represented the center of Hale's laundering operation tonight. $8 million moving through fake marble and real corruption. When it comes up, that's when everything happens. That's when Hale needs you dead. Before you can interfere, before you can bid, before you can draw attention to something he needs buried under applause and legitimacy. Caleb felt his instincts sharpen further. Adrenaline beginning its familiar climb through his system. Not fear, he'd trained fear out of himself years ago, but readiness. The body's preparation for violence. The mind's shift into tactical calculation where every second became a decision point, and every decision carried the weight of life or death. Then we have until Lot 17 to prepare, he said. 12 minutes, Ava confirmed, checking the auction catalog with the precision of someone who'd memorized every timing, every transition, every moment that mattered. 12 minutes to figure out how to survive 3 professional killers and destroy Preston Hale's empire simultaneously. Sounds like plenty of time, Caleb said, and meant it. Ava looked at him then, really looked at him. Her carefully controlled expression cracking just enough to show the woman beneath the curator's professional mask. You're serious? I don't joke about survival, Caleb said. Or revenge. And from what you've told me, we're pursuing both. The auctioneer's voice rose with practiced enthusiasm, declaring Lot 5 open for bidding. The crowd responded with the choreographed interest of people performing wealth rather than experiencing it. And in the margins of that performance, 3 men with rifles waited for their moment, while 2 people with nothing left to lose prepared to burn everything down. Lot 8 sold for $45,000, a minor impressionist landscape that had probably hung in someone's guest bathroom before being elevated to auction-worthy status through creative provenance and strategic marketing. Caleb watched the winning bidder, a tech executive whose fortune came from data mining and whose taste came from interior designers, accept congratulations from the people around him who cared more about the price than the painting. That one's real at least, Ava murmured, her attention shifting between the auction podium and the 3 positions where death waited patiently. Authenticated through the Durand-Ruel Gallery records. Original acquisition documented from the artist's estate sale in 1903. One of maybe 6 genuine pieces in tonight's entire collection. And the rest? Caleb asked, though he already suspected the answer. Forgeries, reproductions, and stolen works with fabricated histories. Ava's voice carried the particular bitterness of an expert watching her field being corrupted from within. Preston Hale has been building his laundering network for 7 years. He started small, buying legitimate pieces at auction, then commissioning reproductions of museum-quality works and swapping them through his restoration business. The museums got the fakes. He kept the originals. No one noticed because the forgeries were that good. She shifted positions slightly, angling them toward a display case containing illuminated manuscripts that Caleb recognized as either impossibly rare or impossibly fake. Given the context, he'd bet everything on fake. Then he got ambitious, Ava continued, her fingers tracing the edge of her champagne flute without drinking, nervous energy channeled into controlled movement. Started commissioning original forgeries, pieces that never existed but could have existed. Renaissance sculptures in the style of Bernini, Baroque paintings in the manner of Caravaggio, pre-Columbian artifacts that match the period but were created in workshops in Mexico City last year. The Bernini we're standing near, Caleb said, understanding crystallizing with the clarity of someone who'd spent years recognizing criminal operations beneath legitimate facades. Carved 6 months ago by a master forger in Florence, Ava confirmed. The artist is brilliant, trained at the academia, worked in museum restoration for 15 years before gambling debts made him vulnerable to recruitment. Hale paid him $200,000 to create a Bernini that never existed, then built an entire provenance history around it. Fake documentation from a Tuscan estate sale, forged authentication letters from dead experts, a paper trail that looks legitimate to anyone who doesn't dig deeper than surface verification. The auctioneer moved to Lot 9, a collection of Japanese woodblock prints that Ava's expression told Caleb were also forgeries, though apparently good enough that the crowd's enthusiasm remained undimmed. Money changed hands. Applause rippled. The machinery of corruption continued its elegant operation. The sculpture is listed at $8 million, Caleb said, processing the scale of the operation with the clinical assessment of someone who'd run his own criminal enterprises and recognized professional execution when he saw it. But the actual value to Hale is what? The laundering capacity? $8 million in dirty money becomes $8 million in legitimate auction proceeds, Ava explained. Her expertise in both art and criminality creating a comprehensive picture that most people would never see. Hale bids on his own pieces through shell companies and offshore accounts. The auction house takes their commission and certifies the transaction as legitimate. The money is now clean. He can invest it, spend it, move it through conventional banking channels without raising flags. Except you found the flags anyway. Jonah found them first. Ava's voice tightened almost imperceptibly, grief surfacing through professional control. He was investigating real estate fraud, luxury developments in Wilmington's waterfront district that were being built on forged land titles and financed through offshore accounts. The paper trail led back to Preston Hale, but not in ways that made immediate sense. Why would a real estate developer need dozens of shell companies in the Cayman Islands? Why were art auction proceeds flowing through the same accounts that financed construction projects? She pulled out her portfolio, opening it to reveal not notes about tonight's auction, but copied documents, photographs, evidence compiled with the methodical precision of someone building a case that could withstand scrutiny. Caleb glimpsed financial records, emails, photographs of forged documents side by side with originals. Jonah started connecting the dots, Ava said, her fingers hovering over a photograph of a young man with her same dark hair and sharp eyes, his expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who'd found truth and couldn't unsee it. He traced the money from Hale's real estate deals to offshore accounts, then from those accounts to art auction purchases, then back into legitimate investments. The art was the washing machine. Beautiful, cultured, completely accepted by institutions that should have been more careful. Caleb studied the documents with the focused attention of someone who recognized both opportunity and danger in equal measure. How much total? Approximately $60 million over 7 years, Ava said quietly, the number hanging between them like a death sentence. $60 million in drug trafficking proceeds, illegal arms sales, human trafficking, and political corruption, all laundered through forged art and charitable donations. Preston Hale presents himself as a philanthropist. He's actually one of the most successful money launderers on the East Coast. Lot 10 concluded, the auctioneer's gavel striking with finality that felt increasingly ominous. 7 more lots until the Bernini. 7 more lots until everything converged. Jonah confronted him, Caleb said, understanding the inevitable trajectory of the story even before Ava spoke it. Jonah believed in giving people chances, Ava said, something breaking in her carefully controlled voice. He thought if he showed Hale the evidence, offered him an opportunity to come clean, maybe it wouldn't have to end in prosecution. Maybe Hale could cooperate, provide information about the larger network, help bring down the people he worked for. Your brother was an idealist. My brother was murdered for his idealism. Ava's eyes met Caleb's, and in them he saw the specific rage that came from watching someone good destroyed by someone evil and being powerless to stop it. Hale invited him to dinner. They met at Hale's estate. Jonah brought the evidence. Copies of everything, thinking it would protect him. That documentation would ensure his safety. It ensured his death. 2 days later, Jonah was found in his apartment with enough fentanyl in his system to kill 3 people. The police ruled it accidental overdose within 48 hours. No investigation. No questions. Senator Douglas Reed personally called the police commissioner to ensure the case was closed quietly. Preston Hale attended the funeral, offered his condolences, donated $50,000 to the Journalism Scholarship Fund in Jonah's name. The bitterness in her voice could have etched glass. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, recognition of grief that mirrored his own, rage that understood the specific helplessness of watching corruption operate with impunity while good people died for trying to fight it. "So you became a curator," he said. "I became a weapon disguised as a curator," Ava corrected. "I spent 18 months building credibility in art authentication, establishing myself as an expert who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about provenance or documentation. I made myself indispensable. Made myself exactly what Preston Hale needed, someone with legitimate expertise who could authenticate his forgeries without exposing them. And he hired you, 6 months ago, to manage his private collection and curate his public acquisitions." She smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Caleb had seen all evening. "He handed me access to everything, every forged piece, every fabricated document, every offshore account, every connection to Senator Reed and the dozen other politicians he owns. He gave me the keys to his entire operation because he believed I was too broken by grief to be dangerous. He was wrong. He's about to learn exactly how wrong." Ava closed the portfolio, her decision made, her path chosen. "I have copies of everything, stored in 3 separate locations, sent to journalists Jonah trusted, programmed to release automatically if I don't check in every 72 hours. Preston Hale has spent 7 years building an empire on forgery and death. Tonight, we're going to burn it all down." The auctioneer moved to Lot 11. The crowd's enthusiasm continued. And Caleb Maddox, who'd spent 15 years building his own empire through methods he couldn't defend and violence he couldn't forget, made a decision that would either save them both or kill them together. Then let's make sure it burns bright enough that everyone can see exactly what he is. Lot 13 sold in a flurry of competitive bidding that pushed the price to twice its estimated value, proving once again that the wealthy cared more about winning than worth. Caleb and Ava had repositioned near the ballroom's southern colonnade, where marble columns provided cover and mirrored panels offered sightlines to all 3 shooter positions. The tactical advantages were minimal but present. In situations like this, minimal often meant the difference between survival and death. "Tell me about your brother," Caleb said quietly, his eyes tracking the balcony where Ray Porter had adjusted position twice in the last 5 minutes, clearly frustrated by the blocked angles that kept putting Ava's body between his scope and Caleb's center mass. "Not the investigation. Not the evidence. Tell me about Jonah." Ava's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her carefully controlled features before settling into something softer, more painful. "Why?" "Because in 7 minutes, we're going to stand in front of 400 people and destroy Preston Hale's empire," Caleb said. "Before we do that, I want to know what we're actually fighting for. Who we're actually fighting for." The string quartet transitioned to Vivaldi, something melancholy and precise, all controlled emotion and mathematical beauty. Ava listened for a moment, her fingers tightening on the champagne flute she'd been carrying for 40 minutes without drinking. "Jonah was 3 years older than me," she began, her voice carrying a different quality now. Less curator, more sister, less weapon, more human. "When our parents died in a car accident, I was 15 and he was 18. The state wanted to put me in foster care. Jonah fought them. Dropped out of college, got 2 jobs, convinced a judge that he could provide a stable home. He raised me, made sure I finished high school, helped me apply to universities, worked nights and weekends so I could have the education he'd sacrificed. Caleb heard echoes of his own history in her words. Different circumstances, same fundamental truth that family meant fighting for the people who'd fought for you, even when the cost became unbearable. He became a journalist because he believed truth mattered more than comfort, Ava continued. He could have taken safer assignments, lifestyle pieces, entertainment coverage, the kind of journalism that paid well and never made enemies. But Jonah believed the purpose of journalism was afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. He went after corruption in city government, exposed police misconduct, investigated corporate fraud that hurt working families. He made enemies. He made the kind of enemies that most people avoid making because survival requires compromise, and Jonah refused to compromise. Her voice cracked slightly, grief breaking through professional control. He received death threats, had his car vandalized, got followed home from the newspaper office by men in unmarked vehicles, and he kept investigating. Kept publishing, kept believing that exposing truth would eventually lead to justice. Lot 14 concluded, a Renaissance bronze that Ava had authenticated as genuine, one of the few honest pieces in an evening built on lies. The winning bidder looked pleased with himself in the way people do when they believe they've acquired culture through currency. When did he start investigating Hale? Caleb asked. 8 months before he died. There was a story about waterfront development, luxury condos being built on land that had been designated for public housing. The usual corruption, the usual pattern of politicians being paid off to rezone property so developers could build expensive units instead of affordable housing. But something didn't track. The developer was paying above market rate for land that should have been worthless, financing construction through accounts that didn't match any conventional lending patterns. Money laundering. Jonah suspected it immediately, started digging deeper, traced the money back through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, then to art auction proceeds in New York and London, then to Preston Hale's restoration business here in Wilmington. The art was the key. Beautiful, legitimate seeming, completely accepted by institutions that should have been more careful about provenance verification. Caleb processed that, his understanding of Hale's operation sharpening with each detail. And when Jonah found proof, he did what he always did, believed in giving people chances, believed in redemption more than I did, more than anyone should given what he'd seen of human nature. Ava's hands trembled slightly, anger and grief creating a volatile combination. He contacted Hale, arranged a meeting, brought copies of the evidence and offered Hale an opportunity to cooperate, to come clean, to help expose the larger network in exchange for some consideration from prosecutors. Hale killed him instead. Hale invited him to dinner at his estate. They talked for 3 hours. Jonah showed him everything: the forged provenance documents, the shell company structures, the connections to Senator Reed. He thought documentation would protect him, that having evidence made him untouchable. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. 2 days later, Jonah was dead. Fentanyl overdose. The police ruled it accidental. Senator Reed personally intervened to ensure no investigation, and Preston Hale attended the funeral, offered condolences, donated $50,000 to a journalism scholarship in Jonah's name. The cruelty of that final detail, Hale using Jonah's death as an opportunity for positive publicity, made something cold settle in Caleb's chest. He'd seen brutality before, committed it himself when necessary. But there was a particular evil in killing someone and then performing grief for social advantage. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, meaning it with the full weight of someone who understood that some losses carved holes that never healed, just learned to hurt differently with time. "I don't want sympathy," Ava said, her voice hardening back into steel. "I want revenge. I want Preston Hale exposed." I want everyone in this ballroom to see exactly what he is. I want his empire dismantled, his money seized, his political connections severed. I want him to lose everything the way I lost everything. And then I want him to rot in a federal prison for the rest of his life. Good, Caleb said, because that's what we're going to give you. Ava looked at him, really looked at him, her carefully controlled expression cracking enough to show vulnerability beneath the weapon she'd made herself become. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. You have your own enemies, your own problems. Why risk your life for someone else's revenge? Caleb considered the question, considered the answer that was both simpler and more complex than she probably expected. I've spent 15 years building an empire through violence and corruption, he said quietly. I've done things I can't defend and killed people who probably didn't deserve killing. I've compromised every principle I was raised with and become exactly what my father warned me I'd become if I chose this path. He paused, organizing thoughts he rarely examined, truths he rarely acknowledged. But I've also always operated by a code, he continued. Loyalty matters. Honor matters. Rules matter. And when someone breaks those rules, when someone kills innocent people to protect their greed, when someone corrupts institutions that should serve justice, when someone operates with complete impunity because they own the politicians and the police, someone needs to stop them. And you've decided that someone is you. I've decided that someone is us, Caleb corrected. You have the evidence. I have the resources. Together, we can do what neither of us could accomplish alone. Expose Hale. Dismantle his network. Make sure your brother's death meant something more than just another casualty of corruption. The auctioneer moved to lot 15. 2 more pieces before the Bernini. 2 more chances for Porter, Barrett, and Cross to find their shot. 2 more opportunities for everything to go catastrophically wrong. I've been investigating Hale for 6 months, Caleb admitted, sharing information he'd kept compartmentalized until now. Different angle than your brother, but leading to the same conclusions. He's been expanding his operations into territory I control, laundering money through properties I own, using my business relationships to legitimize his criminal enterprises without my knowledge or consent. Understanding dawned in Ava's eyes. He's using you. He was using me, Caleb corrected. Until I started noticing discrepancies in property acquisitions, questioning transactions that didn't match standard patterns, following trails that led back to shell companies connected to Preston Hale. I've been gathering evidence, too. Financial records, property deeds, communications with Senator Reid. Everything we need to prove he's been infiltrating legitimate businesses to expand his laundering network. Then tonight isn't just about revenge. Tonight is about justice, Caleb said. For your brother. For every person Hale's hurt. For every institution he's corrupted. And yes, for my own business interests because I refuse to be anyone's unwitting accomplice. Lot 16 concluded. 1 piece remaining before the Bernini. Before everything happened. Before they either survived or died trying. Ava took a breath, steadying herself. Transforming back into the weapon she'd spent 18 months becoming. Then let's make sure it counts. The auctioneer's voice rose with carefully practiced enthusiasm as he introduced Lot 17. Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the crown jewel of tonight's collection, a remarkable Bernini sculpture, Apollo and Daphne, authenticated through extensive provenance research and representing one of the most significant Baroque discoveries in recent decades. We'll open bidding at $4 million. Caleb felt the room's energy shift, attention consolidating on the forged marble sculpture that dominated the northwest corner like a beautiful lie made solid. 400 people leaned forward slightly, their interest piqued by the auctioneer's enthusiasm and the piece's impressive visual presence. Even from across the ballroom, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Daphne's transformation into a laurel tree captured with such dynamic tension that the marble seemed to move. which made the forgery even more insulting. Ava's hand tightened on his arm, her grip carrying the tension of someone about to cross a line from which there was no return. "Once we do this," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear Caleb could feel radiating from her body, "everything changes. Hale will know we're working together. The shooters will adjust. We'll have minutes, maybe less, before they find new angles." "I know," Caleb said. "And you're still willing to—" "Yes," he interrupted, not needing her to finish the question. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." The first bid came from the front row, a real estate developer whose fortune came from displacing working families and whose taste came from whatever increased property values. 4.2 million. 4.5, countered a woman in emerald silk whose jewelry probably cost more than most people's houses. The auctioneer orchestrated the bidding with practiced skill, driving the price upward through competition and ego and the particular psychology that made wealthy people believe worth was determined by what others coveted. 5 million, 5.5, 6 million. Each increment represented money that would be laundered through Hale's network. Dirty proceeds transformed into legitimate auction proceeds, corruption wearing the mask of culture. Caleb felt Ava's body shift beside him, saw her make the decision in the subtle change of her posture. She stepped forward, her champagne gold dress catching light from the chandeliers, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the clear authority of an expert who'd spent years earning the right to speak. "Stop the bidding." The room went silent. The auctioneer paused, his gavel raised, confusion flickering across his professionally pleasant expression. 400 faces turned toward Ava, some curious, some annoyed, some calculating the social implications of this disruption. "I'm sorry," the auctioneer said, his tone carrying polite firmness that suggested she'd made a mistake, and he was giving her an opportunity to correct it gracefully. "Miss Rourke, I believe—" "The sculpture is a forgery," Ava said, each word precisely articulated, carrying the weight of expertise and evidence and 18 months of preparation. "I authenticated this piece as curator of Preston Hale's collection, but I was wrong, or rather, I was lied to. The provenance documentation I was provided has been fabricated. This sculpture was not created by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in 1622. It was created by Antonio Marchetti in Florence 6 months ago." The silence deepened, became absolute. Caleb watched faces in the crowd shift from confusion to shock to calculation. People processing the implications of what Ava had just declared, understanding beginning to crystallize that something fundamental had just fractured beneath the evening's elegant surface. Preston Hale appeared from the VIP lounge entrance, his expression carrying controlled fury wrapped in practiced civility. He was exactly what Caleb expected, mid-50s, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost $10,000 and radiated the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His face was handsome in the way wealth made men handsome. All good dental work and expensive skincare, and the kind of confidence that came from owning politicians and police commissioners. "Miss Rourke," Hale said, his voice pitched to carry sympathy rather than anger, playing to the crowd's perception rather than revealing his actual fury. "I understand you've been under tremendous stress since your brother's tragic passing. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "My brother's murder," Ava corrected, her voice cutting through Hale's performance with surgical precision. "Jonah Rourke was murdered 8 months ago after discovering that you've been laundering $60 million through forged art and stolen works. He confronted you with evidence. You invited him to dinner. 2 days later, he was dead from a fentanyl overdose that was ruled accidental by police who were ordered to close the investigation by Senator Douglas Reed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones appeared, people recording what was rapidly transforming from charity auction to public exposure. Caleb saw several guests edging toward exits, their survival instincts recognizing that remaining in this ballroom meant becoming witnesses to something dangerous. These are serious accusations, Hale said, his expression shifting to concern that would have seemed genuine if Caleb hadn't been watching his eyes. Cold, calculating, already assessing threats and countermeasures. Accusations that I believe stem from grief rather than evidence. I loved Jonah. His death devastated me. To suggest that I had anything to do with... I have the evidence, Ava interrupted, pulling documents from her portfolio with the precision of someone who'd practiced this moment 100 times. Forged provenance files, shell company structures in the Cayman Islands, financial transactions linking art auction proceeds to offshore accounts that finance your real estate developments, communications between you and Senator Reid discussing kickbacks and political protection, and photographs of the workshop in Florence where Antonio Marchetti created this sculpture based on your specifications and your payment of $200,000. She held up the documents. And Caleb saw several phones zoom in, capturing images that would be circulating on social media within minutes. The machinery of exposure operating with its own momentum now, beyond any single person's control. The Apollo and Daphne before you, Ava continued, her voice gaining strength from the truth she'd carried alone for too long, is one piece in a 7-year operation. Preston Hale has been commissioning forgeries, stealing legitimate works, fabricating documentation, and laundering tens of millions of dollars through institutions that trusted him. Museums have been displaying his forgeries. Collectors have been buying stolen pieces. Charities have been accepting donations of art that was never legitimately owned. Hale's mask cracked slightly, fury bleeding through practiced civility. You're making a terrible mistake. The only mistake I made was waiting this long, Ava said. The only mistake Jonah made was believing you deserved a chance to surrender, rather than be destroyed. Caleb stepped forward then, positioning himself beside Ava in a gesture of solidarity that every person in the ballroom would read as alliance. He'd been content to let her lead this confrontation, recognizing that this moment belonged to her, that this exposure was something she'd earned through grief and rage, and 18 months of careful preparation. But now it was time to add his weight to her accusations. Time to make Preston Hale understand that he wasn't just facing a grieving curator with evidence. He was facing Caleb Maddox with resources and reputation, and the kind of criminal expertise that recognized exactly what Hale had been doing and exactly how to dismantle it. Preston Hale has also been using my legitimate business operations to launder his money without my knowledge or consent, Caleb said, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from 15 years of building an empire and understanding every mechanism of criminal enterprise. Property acquisitions through my real estate holdings, art purchases through galleries I'm invested in, financial transactions through banks where I have relationships. He's been exploiting my reputation to legitimize his operations. He pulled out his own phone, pulling up financial records that his team had compiled over 6 months of investigation. I have documentation showing shell companies connected to Hale making purchases through my businesses. Communications with Senator Reid discussing how to use my legitimate operations as cover for illegal activity. Evidence that Preston Hale has been systematically infiltrating and corrupting every business relationship I've built. The auctioneer had backed away from the podium, recognizing that this evening was no longer his to control. Several auction house staff members appeared, clearly receiving instructions through earpieces, their expressions uncertain about whether to intervene or evacuate. Hale's fury was visible now, his carefully maintained mask shattering under the weight of public exposure. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, the threat in his voice barely concealed beneath the veneer of civility. "No idea who you're threatening?" "I'm not threatening anyone," Caleb interrupted. "I'm exposing a criminal enterprise. There's a difference." "And I'm honoring my brother's memory," Ava added. "By finishing what he started. By making sure everyone knows exactly what you are." 400 phones recorded everything. 400 witnesses documented the moment Preston Hale's empire began to crack. And somewhere in the ballroom's shadows, Three men with rifles adjusted their positions and prepared for orders that would either stand down or eliminate everyone who knew too much. The bidding resumed, but everything had changed. What should have been a routine auction had transformed into something else entirely. A public confrontation between a mafia boss and a billionaire developer. Witnessed by 400 people whose phones captured every word, every expression, every moment that would define the scandal already beginning to circulate through social media and news alerts. Caleb stepped forward, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd spent 15 years making power moves in rooms full of enemies. "I'd like to bid on Lot 17, the forged Bernini sculpture. Let's start at $8 million. The auctioneer looked uncertain, caught between professional obligation and the clear understanding that this auction had become something unprecedented. He glanced toward Preston Hale, seeking guidance, but Hale's expression offered nothing helpful. Just barely controlled fury wrapped in the thinnest veneer of civility. That's well above the current bid of $6.2 million, the auctioneer managed, his practiced enthusiasm faltering in the face of obvious chaos. "I'm aware," Caleb said. $8 million for a sculpture we all now know is fake. Seems appropriate, doesn't it? Since the entire operation is built on fake provenance, fake documentation, and fake legitimacy. Hale moved closer, his body language aggressive despite the crowd of witnesses. "You're making a mistake, Maddox. You have no idea what forces you're provoking." $9 million. Caleb interrupted, raising his bid without breaking eye contact with Hale. For a piece of contemporary art masquerading as Baroque. For money laundering disguised as culture. For corruption wearing the mask of philanthropy. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone recognizing they were witnessing something that transcended normal auction protocol. Phones continued recording. Several guests had begun streaming the confrontation live. Within minutes, this would be international news. A charity auction transforming into the exposure of a massive criminal enterprise. $10 million, Hale said, his voice tight with fury barely restrained by decades of practiced control. "Since we're apparently turning this into theater, let's continue the performance." Ava stepped closer to Caleb, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of solidarity. "He's bidding with laundered money," she said, pitching her voice to carry to the recording phones. "Offshore accounts funded by drug trafficking proceeds, illegal arms sales, and political corruption. Every dollar Preston Hale bids tonight is dirty money he's trying to clean through this auction." $11 million, Caleb countered immediately, watching Hale's expression darken with each escalation. "Though we should probably acknowledge that I'm bidding with money I earned through criminal enterprises too. Difference is, I've never pretended to be anything other than what I am." While Preston Hale has spent 7 years hiding behind charitable donations and cultural patronage. The honesty of that admission rippled through the crowd, some shocked, some calculating, some recognizing that Caleb's transparency made him more dangerous than Hale's deception. A criminal who acknowledged his criminality couldn't be blackmailed with exposure, couldn't be controlled through the threat of revelation. $12 million, Hale snarled, his control slipping further with each bid. "And you're both going to regret this performance when—" "When what?" Caleb interrupted, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. "When your 3 shooters eliminate us? Ray Porter on the balcony? Joel Barrett in the service corridor? Liam Cross in the gallery? The professional killers you hired to remove me before I could interfere with tonight's laundering operation?" Complete silence. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, musicians recognizing that continuing would be tone-deaf to the confrontation unfolding. Hale's face went pale, then flushed with rage, his carefully maintained composure shattering entirely. "You have no proof." "I have their names," Caleb said. "Their military records, photographs of them positioned throughout this ballroom with rifles. Communications between you and Marcus Lang, your head of security, discussing the assassination timeline and payment structure. Everything documented. Everything recorded. Everything ready to be delivered to federal authorities the moment this evening concludes. 13 million, Hale said desperately, his bid less about winning the sculpture and more about maintaining some illusion of control in a situation rapidly spiraling beyond his management. You're both dead. You understand that? Both of you. Dead before you leave this building. 15 million, Caleb countered, deliberately jumping the bid to force Hale into a position where his next response would reveal desperation, regardless of whether he continued bidding or withdrew. Final offer. 15 million for a fake sculpture in a fake auction run by a fake philanthropist who's actually one of the East Coast's most successful money launderers. The auctioneer looked completely lost, his professional training offering no guidance for how to handle an auction that had transformed into a public exposure of criminal enterprise. Several security personnel had appeared at the ballroom's edges, though whether they worked for the auction house or Preston Hale remained unclear. Hale stared at Caleb, calculation visible in his expression despite the fury. He was cornered. Continuing to bid would validate everything Caleb and Ava had accused him of, while withdrawing would be public admission of defeat. Either choice represented catastrophic loss of control. 16 million, Hale said finally, his voice carrying the particular rage of someone who'd built an empire on staying invisible and was now being forced into the most public exposure imaginable. Caleb smiled, the expression carrying genuine amusement. You don't have 16 million in legitimate funds, which means you're bidding with the exact offshore accounts Ava just documented. The accounts Senator Reed helped you establish. The accounts funded by every criminal enterprise you've laundered for over 7 years. He turned to the auctioneer, who looked like he desperately wished to be anywhere else. For the record, I withdraw my bid. Let Preston Hale purchase his own forged sculpture with his own dirty money. Let this entire evening stand as documentation of exactly how his operation functions. The implications rippled through the crowd, Caleb forcing Hale to complete the purchase, to publicly move $16 million through channels that were now subject to federal investigation, to create a transaction that would serve as evidence in the criminal prosecution that would inevitably follow. Sold, the auctioneer said weakly, striking his gavel with none of his previous enthusiasm. Lot 17 to Preston Hale for $16 million. Hale looked at Caleb with pure hatred, his mask completely shattered. You're both dead, he said quietly, the threat unmistakable despite the public setting. Before you leave this building, both of you. Then I suppose, Caleb said, taking Ava's hand and turning toward the exit with the casual confidence of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment. We should leave now. Ray Porter adjusted his position on the balcony, his scope tracking Caleb Maddox's movement through the crowd with the practiced patience of someone who'd made 87 kills in 2 combat tours and didn't intend to miss number 88. The target had been moving unpredictably all evening, always keeping the woman in the gold dress between his body and Porter's sightline, always positioning himself near cover that broke clean shot angles. Professional awareness, military discipline. The target understood he was being hunted. Porter's earpiece crackled with Marcus Lang's voice, Hale's head of security coordinating the 3-man kill team with the efficiency of someone who'd planned assassinations before. All units stand by. Target is moving toward the main exit. Barrett, reposition to intercept corridor. Cross, maintain overwatch from gallery. Porter, find your angle. We have authorization for immediate termination. Copy, Porter murmured, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. Years of muscle memory making the rifle feel like an extension of his body rather than a separate tool. He tracked Caleb through the scope, watched him navigate the crowd with the woman still close, their hands linked in a gesture that would look romantic to anyone who didn't understand tactical advantage. Below, In the service corridor that connected the ballroom to the kitchen, Joel Barrett moved with purpose disguised as staff efficiency. His waiter's uniform provided perfect cover, invisible to guests, unremarkable to security, allowing him to position himself exactly where the target would pass on the way to any exit. His weapon was concealed in a service tray, easily accessible, designed for close-quarters elimination with minimal noise. Barrett's hands trembled slightly. Not fear, but the tremor that came from PTSD that the VA had diagnosed and the Marine Corps had buried in medical files marked classified. He'd killed 17 people in Fallujah during a single operation that went wrong in ways that kept him awake at night. Adding 2 more to that count shouldn't matter, but something about tonight felt different. Wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. "Barrett, confirm position." Lang's voice came through the earpiece. "Position confirmed," Barrett responded automatically. "Clear shot on corridor approach. Ready to engage." In the gallery overlooking the ballroom's southern exposure, Liam Cross watched the chaos below with the detached interest of someone who'd stopped caring about context years ago. He'd been officially dead for 5 years, killed in a training accident that was actually a cover for an operation in Syria that had gone catastrophically wrong. The British government had disavowed him. MI6 had erased his records. He'd become a ghost who killed for money because ghosts didn't have other options. His rifle was positioned on a tripod, scope dialed to perfect magnification, breathing controlled to the rhythm that made long-distance shots possible. He'd taken harder shots in worse conditions. This was routine work. Professional execution. Nothing personal. "Cross, maintain overwatch," Lang's voice instructed. "Target is approaching your range. Prepare for green light." "Roger," Cross said, his accent carrying the particular precision of British special operations. "Target acquired. Awaiting authorization." Outside the Wilmington Regent, 3 stories below the ballroom's elegant chaos, Mudrick Cole sat in the driver's seat of an armored SUV and coordinated his own operation with the calm efficiency of someone who'd extracted targets from hostile situations enough times that it had become routine rather than remarkable. His team consisted of 6 operators: former military, former intelligence, former law enforcement, all carefully selected for their ability to function in situations where the rules were flexible and the stakes were absolute. They'd positioned themselves throughout the block, covering every exit, every approach, every angle that mattered. "Team 1, report," Mudrick said into his encrypted radio. "North exit covered," came the immediate response. 2 hostiles visible. Armed. Civilian clothes. Probable Hale security. "Team 2, East service entrance secured. No hostiles currently visible, but monitoring 3 vehicles that match the profile." Mudrick processed the information with the tactical awareness of someone who'd spent 12 years keeping Caleb Maddox alive through situations that should have been fatal. "All teams, target is exiting now. Prepare for immediate extraction. Rules of engagement: defensive only unless hostile fire initiated. Civilian safety is priority. Confirm." Team 1 confirms. Team 2 confirms. Team 3 confirms. Mudrick checked his own weapon, a Sig Sauer P226 that had saved his life in Kandahar and Prague, and a dozen other places where survival had required violence executed with precision. He'd sworn he was done with this life after leaving the military. Then he'd met Caleb Maddox and discovered that some people were worth fighting for, even when fighting required becoming someone you'd promised yourself you'd never be again. Inside the ballroom, Caleb and Ava moved toward the exit with the practiced casualness of people who understood that appearing calm often prevented the panic that got people killed. The crowd parted around them, some faces showing curiosity, some showing fear, all recognizing that remaining close to these 2 people meant becoming part of whatever violence was clearly approaching. 3 shooters, Ava murmured, her voice barely audible beneath the ambient noise of 400 people processing what they'd just witnessed. 3 angles. How do we survive 3 professional killers? We don't survive them, Caleb said quietly. We survive long enough for Mudrick to neutralize them. There's a difference. His phone vibrated. A text from Mudrick containing a single word. Ready. When we exit, Caleb continued, stay close. Move fast but don't run. Head for the black SUV at the north curb. Mudrick will handle everything else. And if he doesn't? Caleb's hand tightened on hers. Then we die together. Which is better than dying alone. The honesty of that statement should have been frightening. Instead, Ava found it oddly comforting. The certainty that whatever happened in the next 5 minutes, she wouldn't face it without someone who understood exactly what they were fighting for and exactly what they were willing to sacrifice. They reached the ballroom's main exit, the doorway opening onto a marble foyer that led to the building's exterior. Through the glass doors, Ava could see the street beyond. Normal city life continuing while inside. Everything had transformed into something dangerous and unprecedented. Ready? Caleb asked. No, Ava admitted. But let's go anyway. They stepped through the doorway together, and 3 rifles adjusted their aim to find the target that had just made himself visible. The marble foyer felt endless despite being maybe 30 feet from the ballroom to the exterior doors. Caleb and Ava moved through it with forced casualness, their hands linked, their bodies close enough that from above they'd present a more difficult target. Overlapping silhouettes that made clean headshots complicated even for professional snipers. Behind them, Preston Hale's voice carried from the ballroom, addressing the crowd with damage control that was already too late. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this evening's disruption. These accusations are false and will be proven false through proper legal channels. Please remain calm while we... The glass door ahead of them shattered. The sound came first, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle finding its target, followed by the visual of safety glass fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that caught the streetlights like falling stars. The bullet had missed Caleb's head by maybe 6 inches, close enough that he felt the displacement of air, close enough that his combat instincts fired with the immediacy of someone who'd survived being shot at enough times to recognize the specific feeling of near death. Down! He shouted, pulling Ava toward the floor as a second shot punched through the remaining glass, embedding itself in the marble column beside them with a sound like thunder compressed into a single violent instant. Ava hit the ground hard, her champagne gold dress sliding on polished marble. Her portfolio scattering documents that represented 18 months of evidence and investigation. Caleb covered her body with his, one hand finding the gun concealed at his lower back, the other pulling out his phone to text Mudrick a single word. Now. A third shot shattered the chandelier above them, crystal raining down like expensive snow, catching light on the way to becoming dangerous shrapnel. Caleb felt something sharp slice across his shoulder. Not a bullet, but broken glass. Pain immediate but manageable. Adrenaline suppressing everything that didn't contribute to survival. Can you move? He asked Ava, his voice urgent but controlled. Yes, she gasped, her own adrenaline clearly operating at maximum capacity. Where? Service corridor. North wall. Mudrick's team will... Gunfire erupted from outside. Not the precise single shots of sniper rifles, but the rapid automatic fire of close-quarters combat. Caleb recognized the sound of his own security team engaging hostiles. The distinctive pattern of suppressive fire designed to create space and opportunity rather than necessarily eliminate targets. That's our window, Caleb said. Move. Fast. They scrambled toward the service corridor, staying low, using the marble columns as cover while above them the balcony shooter, Ray Porter, adjusted angles trying to find a clean line of fire. Another shot punched into the floor inches from Caleb's left foot, close enough that marble chips exploded upward like miniature shrapnel. The service corridor door burst open and Joel Barrett appeared, his waiter's uniform abandoned, his weapon raised. His expression carrying the particular emptiness of someone whose PTSD had transformed human targets into abstractions that didn't require moral consideration. Caleb fired first, 3 rounds center mass, the muscle memory of 15 years of survival, overriding any hesitation about killing someone in a space full of witnesses. Barrett went down hard, his weapon clattering across the floor, blood spreading across white marble in patterns that would haunt Caleb later when adrenaline faded and conscience returned. Ava made a sound. Not quite a scream, more like a gasp of recognition that violence was no longer abstract threat but immediate reality. Caleb grabbed her hand again, pulling her through the corridor while behind them, chaos erupted in the ballroom as 400 witnesses realized they were in the middle of an active shooter situation. The service corridor led to a kitchen, then to a back exit that opened onto an alley where Mudrick had positioned Team 2. The door swung open and hands grabbed them. Professional, efficient, operators who'd done extractions enough times that it had become choreography rather than improvisation. "Vehicles 20 meters north," one of Mudrick's team said, his voice calm despite the gunfire continuing somewhere nearby. "Run straight, don't look back, we'll cover." Caleb and Ava ran. The alley smelled like restaurant refuse and rain, and the particular metallic tang of violence that never quite left urban spaces. Behind them, gunfire continued, Mudrick's team engaging what sounded like multiple hostiles. The distinctive pattern of professional operators working together to suppress and eliminate threats. The black SUV appeared ahead, its armored bulk somehow reassuring despite the fact that armor only mattered if you reached it before bullets found you. The door swung open, and Mudrick's voice came from inside. "Get in, now." They threw themselves into the vehicle, landing in a tangle of limbs and expensive fabric and adrenaline-fueled relief. The door slammed shut. The SUV accelerated with the smooth power of a vehicle designed for exactly this kind of extraction. More gunfire, this time from above. The distinctive sound of a rifle shot hitting armored plating with force that rocked the vehicle slightly but didn't penetrate. Liam Cross from the gallery. Caleb realized, still trying to complete the contract even as everything fell apart around him. "Status?" Caleb asked Mudrick, forcing his voice to stay level despite the adrenaline still flooding his system. "2 hostiles down in the alley," Mudrick reported, his attention split between monitoring his team's communications and navigating the vehicle through evening traffic with the aggressive precision of someone who'd done high-speed extractions on 3 continents. 1 hostile retreating from the gallery. Ray Porter abandoned his position when my team breached the building. He's probably already 3 blocks away." "Barrett? You killed him," Mudrick said without judgment. "Clean shoot, center mass, professional work." Caleb felt something twist in his chest, not regret exactly, but the familiar weight that came from adding another body to the count of people he'd killed in service of survival. Joel Barrett had been trying to kill him, had been a threat requiring elimination. But he'd also been a Marine with PTSD who'd taken a job he shouldn't have taken because the money was good and the alternative was worse. Beside him, Ava was shaking. Full body tremors that suggested adrenaline crash beginning. The physiological response to surviving something that should have been fatal. Her dress was torn, blood on her hands from cuts she probably hadn't realized she'd sustained. Her carefully styled hair fallen loose in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable, more human than the controlled curator who'd stood in that ballroom and exposed Preston Hale's empire. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked gently, his own hands moving over her body to check for injuries with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd done battlefield triage. "I don't know," Ava said, her voice hollow. I can't feel anything. Is that normal?" "That's adrenaline," Mudrick said from the driver's seat. his tone carrying the particular gentleness of someone who'd talked people through shock before. "You'll start feeling everything in about 10 minutes. It's going to hurt. But you're alive. That's what matters." The SUV turned onto a wider street, accelerating through a yellow light, putting distance between them and the Wilmington Regent, where chaos was probably reaching peak intensity. As police arrived and witnesses tried to explain what they'd seen, and Preston Hale attempted damage control that was already far too late. Ava made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and pressed her hands against her face. "We did it," she said, her voice muffled but carrying something that might have been triumph if it wasn't so thoroughly mixed with trauma. "We actually did it. We exposed him. In front of everyone. All of it. Everything Jonah died trying to prove." "You did it," Caleb corrected gently. "This was your operation. Your evidence. Your courage. I just provided support." Ava looked at him then. Really looked at him. Her carefully controlled mask completely shattered to reveal the woman beneath. Exhausted, traumatized, triumphant, grieving, all of it simultaneously. "You saved my life," she said. "Multiple times. The shooters would have killed me if you hadn't." "We saved each other," Caleb interrupted. "That's how this works. That's how we survived." The SUV turned again, heading toward a safe house Mudrick had prepared for exactly this scenario. A warehouse in the industrial district, secure, anonymous, equipped with everything they'd need to survive the next 72 hours, while federal authorities processed the evidence and media processed the scandal. And Preston Hale's empire collapsed under the weight of exposure it could no longer contain. Ava's trembling intensified, her breathing becoming ragged, and Caleb recognized the signs of someone whose adrenaline crash was arriving with the force of everything they'd suppressed to survive the immediate danger. She'd held herself together through 18 months of preparation, through tonight's confrontation, through the assassination attempt and the escape. Now, finally safe enough to break down, her body was demanding payment for that control. "It's okay," Caleb said quietly, pulling her against his chest, one hand moving to her hair with surprising gentleness for someone whose hands had just killed a man. "You're safe now. You can let go." And she did, collapsing into him with the full weight of grief and rage and trauma and triumph, sobbing with the intensity of someone who'd been holding back tears for 8 months while pretending to be someone else. Something else. Anything other than a sister who'd lost her brother and spent every day since planning revenge. Caleb held her, his own chest tight with emotions he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Grief for his own losses, respect for her courage, and something else he couldn't quite name that felt dangerously close to connection with another person who understood what it meant to fight alone and lose everything and keep fighting anyway. Outside the armored windows, Wilmington passed by in familiar patterns, city lights and traffic and normal life continuing while inside the SUV, two people who'd just survived something impossible tried to process what survival actually meant. The safe house was a converted warehouse in Wilmington's industrial district. 3 stories of exposed brick and reinforced steel, with security systems that could detect an approach from 3 blocks away, and defensive positions that would give even professional operators significant tactical challenges. Mudrick had chosen it specifically for situations like this, when immediate safety mattered more than comfort and survival required distance from anyone who might be searching. Caleb and Ava sat on a leather couch that had seen better days, surrounded by equipment and supplies that suggested Mudrick had been preparing for this extraction for weeks. Medical supplies, communications gear, weapons, food, everything necessary to survive independently for as long as required. Ava had stopped shaking, her adrenaline crash transforming from active breakdown into exhausted numbness. Caleb had treated the cuts on her hands, shallow lacerations from broken glass, nothing requiring stitches but enough to hurt now that sensation was returning. His own shoulder wound was worse than he'd initially thought. A deep slice from crystal shrapnel that Mudrick had cleaned and bandaged with the efficient skill of someone who'd done battlefield medicine. Preston Hale is currently at the Wilmington police station, Mudrick reported, reading updates from his encrypted phone. Brought in for questioning about the auction disruption. FBI has seized his financial records. Senator Douglas Reed is refusing to comment. 3 of Hale's properties have been raided simultaneously. The story is everywhere. National news, international coverage, social media trending. Everything you exposed is now public record. Jonah would have loved that, Ava said softly, her voice carrying exhaustion and something that might have been peace if it wasn't so thoroughly mixed with grief. He always believed sunlight was the best disinfectant. That public exposure could accomplish what legal prosecution couldn't. He was right, Caleb said. Hale might hire the best lawyers money can buy. Might try to delay prosecution through legal maneuvering. But he can't undo what happened tonight. Can't make 400 witnesses forget what they saw. Can't erase the documentation you've been compiling for 18 months. Ava nodded, her eyes distant, processing something internal that Caleb couldn't read. I need to contact Jennifer Morrison, Jonah's friend at the FBI. She's been waiting for me to deliver the full evidence package. Tonight makes that possible. Makes everything possible. We'll coordinate with federal authorities tomorrow, Mudrick said. Tonight, you both need rest. Food. Time to let your bodies process what they just survived. The war continues tomorrow. Tonight, you're safe. He left the room with the practiced tact of someone who recognized when his presence was no longer helpful, heading upstairs to coordinate with his team and monitor communications from law enforcement and media sources tracking the scandal's rapid spread. Silence settled between Caleb and Ava, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with everything that had happened in the last 3 hours, with the violence and exposure and survival that had transformed strangers into allies and allies into something closer to partners. Thank you, Ava said finally, the words seeming inadequate for what she actually meant, but all the language available could offer. For believing me, for helping me, for risking your life for revenge that wasn't even yours. It became mine, Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. The moment you warned me about the red dot, the moment you chose to trust me instead of running, the moment we became partners in something that mattered more than just survival. He paused, organizing thoughts that felt dangerous to speak aloud, but necessary anyway. I've spent 15 years building an empire through violence and corruption, he continued, his fingers unconsciously tracing the tattoos on his left hand. Serpents and compass roses and Latin phrases about honor and death. I've done things I can't defend, hurt people who probably didn't deserve it, become exactly what I promised myself I'd never become. And I've been alone through all of it because trust is a luxury that criminals can't afford. Ava listened without interrupting, her dark eyes holding his with the kind of attention that made vulnerability feel less terrifying. Tonight was the first time in 15 years that I've fought for something other than survival or power, Caleb said. The first time I've risked everything for someone else's justice instead of my own interests. And it felt right. In ways I didn't know were still possible. You're a better man than you believe yourself to be, Ava said softly. You've convinced yourself that criminality defines you. But everything I've seen tonight suggests otherwise. Suggests you still have principles. Still have honor. Still have the capacity to fight for something that matters. Maybe, Caleb acknowledged. Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone. The admission hung between them. Raw, honest. The kind of vulnerability that most people spent lifetimes avoiding. Ava reached out, her bandaged hand finding his. her fingers interlacing with his in the same gesture they'd used to survive the ballroom's dangers. "You don't have to be alone," she said quietly. "Not anymore. Not if you don't want to be." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, not quite relief, but something between them that felt like the possibility of becoming someone different than who he'd been. Someone who fought for more than just survival. Someone who trusted another person enough to build something honest from the wreckage of everything they'd lost. "Stay," he said, the word coming out rougher than intended, carrying the weight of someone asking for something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. "Please, not just tonight. Not just until the danger passes. Stay. Help me figure out what comes next. How to turn this." He gestured vaguely at the warehouse around them, at the weapons and security systems and evidence of a life lived on the edge of violence, into something that matters. Something Jonah would have been proud of. Something that honors what he believed about truth and justice and doing the right thing even when it costs everything. Ava's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over, grief and exhaustion, and something that might have been hope combining into an emotional release she'd been holding back for 8 months. "Jonah would have liked you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. He would have seen past the tattoos and the criminal empire to the man underneath. The man who believes honor matters. Who risks everything to protect someone who warned him about danger. Who fights for justice even when it's not his own. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his, their breathing synchronizing in the quiet warehouse. While outside, the city continued its normal rhythms, and somewhere Preston Hale's empire continued its collapse, and federal authorities continued processing evidence that would reshape Wilmington's criminal landscape. "I'll stay," Ava whispered. "Not just tonight. Not just until the danger passes. I'll stay because I don't want to be alone anymore either. Because 18 months of pretending to be someone else has exhausted every defense I have. Because you're the first person since Jonah died who's made me believe that trust is still possible. That building something honest from tragedy is still possible." Caleb pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with surprising gentleness for someone whose hands had killed and hurt and destroyed. They sat like that for a long time. Two people who'd survived impossible odds, who'd exposed corruption that should have stayed hidden, who'd found each other in the middle of violence and chosen to build something better from the wreckage. Outside, Mudrick monitored communications and coordinated with authorities. News cycles continued their coverage. Preston Hale hired lawyers. Senator Reed issued denials. The machinery of justice and scandal operated with its own momentum. But inside the warehouse, Caleb and Ava simply held each other and let themselves believe that survival was just the beginning. That justice was possible. That honor mattered. That two people who'd lost everything could build something worth keeping from the ashes of everything they'd destroyed. "What happens next?" Ava asked eventually, her voice steadier now, exhaustion giving way to the planning instincts that had kept her alive through 18 months of dangerous undercover work. "We finish what Jonah started," Caleb said with quiet certainty. "We deliver your evidence to federal authorities. We testify against Hale and Reed and everyone connected to the laundering network. We use my resources and your expertise to expose every remaining piece of the operation. And then? Then we figure out what comes after revenge," Caleb said. "What justice looks like when the war is over. How to build lives that honor the people we've lost instead of just punishing the people who took them from us." Ava nodded, her hand tightening on his. Jonah would say that's the hard part. That destroying evil is easier than building good. That revenge is simpler than redemption. Your brother sounds like he was wise. "He was," Ava said, grief and pride mixing in her voice. "And he'd want me to live. Really live. Not just survive while planning revenge. not just exist as a weapon aimed at the person who killed him. He'd want me to find something worth building instead of just something worth destroying. Then that's what we'll do, Caleb said. Together. The word felt right, natural. The beginning of something that neither of them could have predicted when Ava had leaned close in that ballroom and whispered about red dots and danger and the choice between running alone or fighting together. Together, Ava agreed. And in her voice, Caleb heard the same tentative hope he felt. Fragile, uncertain, but real enough to build on. Real enough to fight for. Real enough to believe that surviving impossible odds was just the first chapter of something larger. Outside the warehouse, Wilmington continued its transformation. From a city where corruption operated with impunity to a city where exposure demanded accountability. The scandal would take months to fully unfold. Prosecutions would take years. Some people would escape justice through expensive lawyers and political connections. But Preston Hale's empire was broken. His network exposed. His victims vindicated. And two people who'd had nothing left to lose had found each other in the middle of violence and chosen to build something honest from the wreckage. The war against corruption wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But tonight, sitting in a warehouse surrounded by evidence and weapons and the promise of tomorrow, Caleb and Ava let themselves believe that victory was possible. That honor mattered. That two people who understood loss could build something worth keeping. Stay, Caleb whispered again, the word carrying less desperation now, more certainty. Please, I'm not going anywhere, Ava promised, and meant it with every part of herself that had survived 8 months of grief and rage and dangerous preparation. They stayed like that, holding each other, planning tomorrow, letting themselves believe that the hardest part was over, even though they both knew the real work was just beginning. Together. Always together. And somewhere in the city, justice prepared its slow but inexorable approach.